This is a presentation on whole being heart realization by myself, Rod Taylor, at the Canadian Rockies Virtual Retreat, September 2020. So hello everyone, and lovely to be with you to do this presentation. I'll start off by just connecting this presentation of whole being heart realization with the work that we do in Trillium Awakening in terms of our evolution into whole being realization. And whole being realization, from my perspective, is something that is reasonably new to humans in terms of realizing consciousness, conscious embodiment, and non-separate interconnectedness as a whole being realization that together allows us to live in the ground of being, in connection with others, and in the recognition of consciousness and the awareness nature. And that work starts with folks who come to this work who find themselves looking for something more to get in touch with all of who they are. And very often people who have been on other paths of accomplishment or seeking or finding find that those parts of their life that were working towards something feel like they're changing. And there's more of a direction to be inward, to meeting what is, to meeting what's challenging, to meeting what feels incomplete. And we found that Trillium Awakening is one of those support services for folks who are ready to kind of meet themselves in more intimate ways. Intimate meaning not resisting, not fixing, but coming into touch with, allowing to unfold, finding our wholeness in that way. And the whole being realization is a shift. Some people call it their awakening. Some people have called it their second birth awakening because it's like a birth into a different way of living in wholeness as ourself. Well, that whole being realization is a profound shift that is including the full dimensions of self, creation, and consciousness. And what we found when that realization comes on, there's a whole process of integration that goes on. It seems to open the doorway to meeting ourselves in new ways, aspects of ourself that are unfinished, elements of ourself that perhaps couldn't be really met without having this shift into our realization of all of ourselves, the whole being range. And then we meet elements that are confusing or hurting or wanting of healing and recognition or understanding. And that process of meeting and integrating, we found through experience, goes on for months and years. And we've often said in Trillium that process of integration can take something like 4 to 7 years, and certainly more, depending on the degree to which we're able to work through what we have and the extent to which our life allows us to lean into it as we're going through it. And that's generally where we have kind of come to a deep engagement, a lot of us who have been involved in this work. So this area of heart realization has been one that's been not so clearly defined or clearly understood when, how, and what it is. And some people, when they have their whole being realization, feel like there's a strong heart experience that goes along with it. And some don't notice that particularly. But all of us in life have found our heart being touched, usually in different ways, with our parents or siblings over time, perhaps with someone special, or with animals that we love, or with nature that we feel a movement of our heart. It can show up in a lot of ways. But you could say, and I would say, that without this ground of whole being realization, we don't have a foundation for realizing the full range of heart experience on that ground. And so when some people have that whole being awakening move, then they will notice kind of enhanced aspects of the heart. Sometimes it's quite a blowout. And for some, the change isn't obvious. And I was one of those. I had my whole being realization, which was quite undeniable to me when that shift occurred. But after a little bit of time went by, I began to wonder. I'd heard that there was a heart awakening aspect that could be going on. And I realized that I didn't notice a shift in that area. So I was one of those people who knew that realization as a definite shift that I could acknowledge and claim and was recognized in our work by someone who was qualified to have that conversation and confirm it. So that was in place. But what about the heart? I thought to myself, and occasionally out loud. And so there wasn't anything to be done about it. You know, there was no place to go. There wasn't something that had to be looked for, because when that shift occurred for me into whole being realization, the seeking urge that I had carried all my adult life just went away. That's not true for everyone, but it was for me. It was like night and day, that urge for more, to find the right words, to learn how to move further in my life, find out new things. It wasn't that I wasn't still interested in life and the world, but the hunger and that drive wasn't there. So when I was noticing, what about the heart? I know love, as I have in my life, I have children and have been in close, intimate connection with folks. So I know that activation of love, but I didn't know how it related to whole being nature, and definitely how that shift didn't make it obvious to me what was more included in that way. So that was the ground of my curiosity, and a lot of my discoveries and further discoveries in this whole being realization field have come through wondering about things. It seemed like that was the doorway, and then I began to kind of discover things. I wasn't figuring it out and finding them. I just had an open inquiry, and I had experiences that kind of answered some of that question. So I'm going to share that with you tonight, because it's not just for me a generalized good feeling or some kind of increase, but for me it's definitive shifts of heart nature that surprised and pleased me over time as those things showed up. And so I'm going to take you through a description that'll include some charts that clarify the way that I've made sense of it for myself and a way that I can talk to others about it. So to do that, I'm going to share screen so it gives me a vehicle of expression to show and to talk about. And just before I do that, I'm just going to check in if there's any questions or comments right at this moment. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on and we'll see where we go and what might arise in you to wonder about. So whole being heart realization. And what I considered my non-process process, if I might put it that way, not really knowing how to move towards heart or what to do, but just with that open curiosity, eventually it came in retrospect into a kind of a statement of discovering and living love. That, when I look back, was my orientation. In other words, it wasn't passive, I was curious, interested. And it came through the dimensions of self that were awakening. Dimensions of self, meaning universal conscious nature. Now, I might say one more thing about my introduction, and that is that 4 to 7 years of integration, they led for me into a shift that I now call a whole being continuity realization. One in which there was a seamless continuity of life that didn't mean there wasn't fluctuations in my experience, some more challenging, some more easy, but I'd actually come into a stable ground that was unshakable. While I might feel a little focused on this or uncomfortable here, the oscillations that in that post-whole being realization process that would go on had a ground, so that if there was waves of experience, the ground was trustable, knowable, and continuous. And so it's on this ground that I consider the foundation for whole being heart realization. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't being experienced in flashes or in real kind of noticing and realizations before whole being realization or at whole being realization or ongoing. But I do propose that to have a whole being heart realization established and integrated fully, then it really does need the whole being realization realized and stabilized in this whole being continuity realization and living a seamless awake life. That is a beautiful foundation so that the heart can be whatever is discovered, enlivened, and realized. So in that condition of recognizing these dimensions that are now well established in our life, one of those dimensions is our universal conscious nature. Now, that expression came from my own kind of wondering about this integrated nature, and notice just how I could clearly recognize my own universal conscious nature. And I could discriminate it in some way, not separate, but just feel the flavors of self in this universal conscious nature, in this personal manifest nature, meaning in the body, emotional nature, feeling sense, and in the interconnected mutual nature. Now these seem abstract terms, but in my nature, my character being a very kind of discriminative individual and someone whose awakening seems to have shifted in increments that are helpful to me recognizing, and especially talking about it as a teacher. Well, for me, that discriminative awake nature as conscious nature, discriminative awake ground in my own bodily, emotional, manifest nature. You could say sitting initially was holding the core paradox, but actually holding that inner, what felt like a paradox, I discovered that my own nature, the experience of myself fluctuated on whether I was more separate from my inner nature or more connected to that inner core paradox. And I began to see that I was the relatedness element in that inner core. So in other words, what was infinity or infinite, and what was the finite ground of my material nature, limited nature, there was my emotional feeling nature, which was intimately a part of the dance of the three. And I later realized and described it as a core triadox, a play on the word paradox, which is two elements that are unmergeable, but are also not separable. They're in relationship, you could say. Well, I discovered my own way of my own nature's perception or recognition of those became a three-way group, a three-way dimension of elements that were unmergeable and inseparable. That my emotional nature and the way that I noticed and felt this inner core paradox shifted from paradox to triadox, where it was infinite, finite, and the relationship between them, which was me. And I could feel those fluctuations as I kind of felt the fluctuations of myself, a little more separate from that inner core to a little more intimate and a little more connected. And so that insight was profound to me, to kind of recognize what had been paradoxical into something that was triadoxical. And it both was affected by and gave clarity to these particular dimensions that are me: conscious nature, manifest nature, and mutual nature, the relatedness nature. And for me, it was quite a discovery, and it's been the ground for further refinements that are based on recognizing the dynamic of creation that has always been source into three, into all manifest existence. Now I'm going to go on and share with you about the nature of love that's been discovered in these three dimensions of awakened integrated self. And before that, I'll just come out of this share screen and check in with you to see whether that has meaning to you, whether you've noticed that at all, and if you have any questions. So just looking right now at those dimensions of our self-nature, how does that resonate with some? Does it kind of strike a note? Does it bring up questions?
Can you say a little more about manifest nature, what exactly that means?
Yeah, I felt the distinguishing aspect of material me. I have a body, I have emotions, and it's not the same as the conscious kind of that spacious awareness me, and not the same kind of domain as the relatedness field in which I recognize my connectedness to everything. So it has its own truth, a form, an existence, the ground or the seed of myself, you could say. The tangible. So does that say something, or do you have any other prodding question?
Or? No, I think that helps. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
And
that inner core, that inner core nature, that manifest nature, I've found is not a passing interest. It's a crucial piece. That's what we're awakening into in the whole being realization, rather than into consciousness only, or into energetic bodily, subtle bodily energy only, or into, kind of relationship. This is us. This is myself that's awakening into whole being realization. For each of us, we actually are realizing it in embodiment. And we're doing that in this work by honoring the inner discomfort in being alive. Discomfort for some that feels like a wound, for some more like a confusion, for some a paradoxical existential uncertainty. But we're awakening through allowing ourselves to come into a relationship with that. And that is not just a significant element for whole being realization, but I've discovered it's become a significant element for advancing and refined stages of realization. So the finite bodily, emotional, mental nature, meaning the manifest, even in the subtle form, is our ground for not just awakening and whole being realization, but continued refinement as an embodied realizer. So a few more words for that. Yes, Cynthia.
Thank you. Oh, it's dark in there. Sorry. I'm trying to feel my way into understanding what you called the triadox, which I think I heard you say, the infinite, the finite, and the relationship between them, which is, I think you said, which is us.
Yeah. Is our feeling component of ourself.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to kind of formulate my question.
Great.
So guess I have had the idea that both the infinite and the finite are contained within our humanness.
Yeah.
But this description of there's the infinite, the finite, and the relationship between them, and that's us, that sounds different.
It's inclusive of what you had understood, but it's adding something. And that adding something is where our realization allows us to be being, to become being. While we're holding that inner wound, inner paradox, inner confusion, or even as we're conscious as it, there's a way we are holding it. As we discover our intimacy with it, if I feel more separate, I feel more discomfort. I feel more close, and I'm able to be more conscious as it. I feel more wellness and settledness. As we notice that we're actually part of the three, we are one of the three, it is the ground which is yet to emerge, and I talk about that in later and other talks, perhaps the last actually retreat I included this, but that's where we can shift from holding and being conscious as to living as, because we are realizing the third element of creation, not at this moment where it's a triadox, but in the next realization when we discover core love. And that comes through this whole being heart realization. When we go through that full realization, we find not only unconditional love and personal, interpersonal love, we find the seat or truth of love in our embodiment. When that happens, the triadox emerges through the realization of core love, that is now one of the three, into the fire of creation. Infinity, really it's consciousness, being, and love. But we don't want to kind of go there based on belief. We want to go there based on our own discovery of our own awakened nature, holding and becoming conscious as that inner paradox. And then as we become more and more intimately conscious in and as that realization, we start to find that our feeling nature is part of that circle. In fact, that's why we felt uncomfortable or even wound-like, because we've actually been more separate in relationship to our origin. As we become more and more conscious as that paradox, we discover our intimacy of feeling nature with it. And so it's triadoxical because it's infinite, finite, and the self. But when the self discovers self as core love, not loving, but love, core love, then we have infinite as consciousness, manifest as being, and the realized self as love. We're realizing the origins of creation that manifest as all of multiplicity. And initially we realize it, and then we become it as we mature in integrating in it, so that we're actually living this expression that was the original underlying manifestation as creation, but now we have realized it consciously and begin to consciously notice we are being it. So that's my enthusiastic.
Appreciate the enthusiasm.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. It's so helpful. Did you have anything more?
No, I just need the interplay of separate and then unified. I need to sit with that.
Yeah. And the unified at this stage is not oneness, it's threeness, allness, fireness, creation emergingness.
We need different words besides both and. We need something and.
Yeah, there needs to be another and. So it is both and, as you say. And it's not a belief or a projection, but it's a delving into being who we are and noticing what we find. And I'm sharing what I've found.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one last question.
Sure.
How does the Tridex connect with the 3 trillium flowers?
It connects beautifully, of course, because we're realizing consciousness, conscious embodiment, and non-separate interconnection. That's the relatedness field. So this is where we realize the relatedness field into not just relatedness, but loveness. And this is what tonight's talk is about the heart realization component. It may show up in various forms at any point, but I'm going to point out how there's 3 dimensions of heart realization. What humans have typically talked about in terms of heart realization is a profound opening of emotional connection. That's, people typically will talk about the emotional love. Emotional love, from my perspective, is one of 3 dimensions. And so when we begin to notice that, it gives us a discriminative wholeness that requires whole being integration to really fully let it be seated and known. And so then we find in every realization, you could say, the 3 petals of Trillium. And that's what I'll share right now about the heart realization. The 3 petals show up in beautiful and clear ways that are grounded in our original realization, our integrated realization, and then our confirmation of our heart nature, which is what I'm sharing tonight. So here we go. So when we look at what might come, as we just are open to discovering and living love and being curious in each of these dimensions of our self-realization, then whole being heart realization is the realization not of one thing, but of the discriminative elements of the whole thing. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone will notice those incremental shifts in 3, but they were very clear and significant for me to notice them because they came one after the other at different points in my life experience. And so they've been a profound both realization, but also tool as a teacher to share with others. But if this whole being heart realization on the ground of our integrated whole being realization show up, it could show up at one movement in the whole. But we would, just like we can discriminate our initial whole being realization, and we can have a conversation, a clarifying conversation with people in our work. I do this role as well. Then we can talk about it in terms of that original realization, in terms of consciousness or awareness, embodiment, conscious embodiment, and also that non-separate interconnectedness. People who have the shift into awakening might not be discriminative initially, but as they mature in it and they have this conversation, they notice the dimensions of the awakening. So I'm suggesting that's true in whole being heart realization, whether it shows up incrementally or whether it shows up in one shift, but later discriminated. And the discrimination is just part of the glory of our realization. You know, it's discriminative intelligence aware of what's been realized. And that's part of the reason why we find it so enlivening in this work to have a whole being realization and then confirm it and claim it, because it just gives us more of the illumination of what we've realized that our being had been longing for. So I'm suggesting so too with heart. And so in the universal conscious nature, heart awakened aspect of that shows up as unconditional love. Unconditional love is not the emotional love that we normally might equate with a relationship between 2 people who love each other, the flow of emotion. This isn't that. This is where the field of awareness that holds everything, holds them in love. Not emotional love, but more impersonal love. The truth of love that is different and than emotional love, but unconditional. And I must say, for someone like me who had, always never been loving enough in my life and always thinking I should be more loving, it was a remarkable gift to discover this opening and discovering my conscious nature, which I seated in my heart. And that conscious nature I'd come to know as inclusive of everything. There was no end to this conscious nature that we're realizing in this whole being field. So when I found that my conscious nature, awakened conscious nature, was seated in my heart, in the chest, actually in the right side there, it was I found out, I discovered that everything was included in that holding in the heart, unconditionally. And I found that I could even be irritated with someone or not like somebody and still unconditionally love them without effort, just because that was the truth of realization that had shifted for me at some later point in my process, post whole being realization and integration going on. And in terms of my personal manifest nature, my body emotional nature, I found embodied love. And that too was not emotional love. When I discovered it one day in a situation where I was in a garden of beauty in a sunny day, and I was just touched and moved by it. And all of a sudden, I just felt this reverberation go through me in the meeting of beauty, and it was a reverberation of my heart. But I wasn't loving something. I was experiencing and being with the beauty. And it was in me and enlivened in the seeing and experiencing. And that was what actually, when that occurred, which occurred first, it was like, oh my gosh, this is a heart awakening, a heart realization, this whole being realization, because it was undeniable. I could feel the love reverberating through my body, not towards something, but actually, reverberating through my being. And so that, of course, hasn't diminished in terms of a recognition of love as form. So different than unconditional love, the field of unconditional, and different than the interpersonal domain, but actually love as form, love in the cells, love is. And of course, the interpersonal mutual nature, interpersonal love. That flow of emotion towards somebody that we love, or something that we love, or nature that we love, but that flow of emotion. And I actually felt like all of those were clear to me, particularly since the embodied love and unconditional love had shown up as specific realizations. And then I knew interpersonal love. So I felt they were all there. But it was actually later, actually a few years later, that I had the realization of mutual love, but this was with all that is loving me. And that wasn't something I was looking for or expecting, but one day, through the living of life, in the flow of life, it just all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, I'm loved by being. And many people may have wanted to be loved by being or loved by God, but it wasn't something I ever thought about. And that experience changed so much. There was nothing that the emotional and flow of love wasn't available to both love and to be loved by. And it felt like, for me at least personally, that final shift where, I wasn't just lovable, but I was actually loved, just the truth of it. And when those three came together, that is what I call the beauty of whole being heart realization. And for some, as I said, people may not all have them showing up in increments, but may find that shift sooner or later coming into kind of a whole experience, and may not discriminate these. And whether that people are interested in doing that or not, I don't know. It's not crucial, but it's crucial for me as a teacher to share that, that glorious nature of heart that can be both realized in whatever form it shows up, but can unfold further in any of these elements that we feel curious about, encouraging in, discovering through. And this is where core love can show up as self. And this is what I call whole heart awakening. And I would say, and you probably can relate to this, but often when people talk about heart awakening, typically it's about emotional heart. And for some, it's unconditional heart. But in the whole being realm that we are now engaged in, this is a dimension in which the three petals of Trillium Awakening and those three fundamental elements of emergence from source into all of creation, we can find the flavors included in the heart realization as definitive elements that can be just lived and enjoyed as one, or discriminatively recognized in their shades and colors. It's just the beauty of our individuality, being able to open and notice in whatever ways our nature is drawn to. And I would say that in the grounded whole being continuity realization, or that living a seamless continuity experience of life, that nothing is needed. So we're not having to seek for heart. Aspects of heart will already be maybe in different flavors and sharing, but it's not a seeking, and it wasn't for me. In fact, I consider that integrated whole being realization the potential ground of fulfillment, because there's nowhere to go. We just keep dropping back into the self with any discomfort and find that ground of trust, freedom, and love is just always there. So there's further dimensions of unfoldment in our whole being realization, in which I talk about, in my work that I've shared before, 7 definitive realizations unfolding that start with whole being realization and continue to define shifts occurring as we integrate and continue in our whole being realization unfoldment that occurs in its own time and in its own way. So this is the third shift in my experience, and in my also recognition of the capacity to further discover. I would say that this heart realization is quite beautiful, fundamental to color the flavor of Tridex into a lovedox, infinity, being, and love. Love is the dynamic that, is the catalytic force of life, in my sense of it. So I'll share a little more about what goes on as we synthesize this and come into living it, but I'm going to stop sharing here and just see if there's any questions or comments. Anything anyone's wondering about? Any flavors of experience that you've had that feel more like unconditional, more like love emotional, more like in your body? Have you had any experiences that have given you tastes of that you might have noted and might like to share with us at this moment? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I've had some experiences of just the feeling of love, just like not coming from anywhere in particular, just flowing from wherever,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's just beautiful.
Lovely. As living human beings, we can tap in and have experiences of what I've talked about at any point in our unfoldment. We don't have to have had our realization or be integrated. I'm just suggesting the graded ground of our whole being realization is a stabilizing place to integrate the heart. But we can have these realizations at any point if we're alive and evolving. So it's beautiful to hear that experience. Any other experiences that feel reminiscent of what I was talking about in terms of those distinguishing aspects of, for instance, the emotional field and even being loved by creation and loving all of creation or God or being, whatever we might call it, or that sense of unconditional that you can, as your nature can hold anything, or that bodily reverberation of love in and as the cells and form. Yes, Corey.
Well, I appreciate this discourse, Rod. I've, for a long time, known that there's a difference between emotional love and this other kind of unconditional love that you seem to be speaking of. I don't think I could give a good definition of what either of them is exactly. Like how do you know? It's. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, other than that I recognize the difference between the two, and this more unconditional love that I think I'm recognizing in what you're speaking about is, it's to me it's just about impossible to put any kind of words to it or description of it. It's just something that you recognize it when it makes itself more obvious, but what there is to be said about it, I don't have anything. I don't have anything left at that point.
Yeah, thank you for that. Of course, yeah, the wordlessness of it all. And my words came up because I felt all of a sudden the freedom to be me as a loving person, not having to do a thing. Just my realized conscious nature was true of that holding seated in my heart. So that's kind of what I felt the shift in. But as you say, how can we put words? We can, but they're nothing like the whole of it. So thank you. Yeah. Yes, Carrie.
Let's see if I can grab onto this again. Again, language is such a approximation and certainly subjective. But when we talk about consciousness, would you say that, or pure awareness, would you say that love is an attribute of that when it's flowing? When there's a flow of awareness back on itself, that current could be called love, or does it somehow have a different experience? Would you frame it differently?
Yeah, I think I'm acknowledging there's not a right way to frame. We're talking in that field of abstract, but I appreciate the question because I do distinguish between whole being realization becoming known in its heart flavors from a later stage of sacred heart realization, which I've talked about at different times and I might mention at the end here. But in other words, what I was surprised to discover in a particular situation I've described at times, in which actually my body was quite exhausted from being having walked at very high elevation. So I was kind of really not feeling comfortable the next day. And so there was a way my body was very gross. And I was just kind of seated there. And I wondered, okay, well, I don't feel very good. And I had these expectations. I was in the mountains, I'd have a lovely spiritual experience. And here I was feeling miserable from walking too long, too high. And I was sitting there and I thought, boy, you know, where's consciousness now? And as soon as I had that thought, it was the clearest distinction. Instead of consciousness being realized in the head center, it actually flowed right through and was seated in the right side of my heart in a point of openness. And it was in that moment that I realized there wasn't anything not included, because that's the nature of my realization of consciousness. And it was seated in the heart, in a way held in love, but not emotional love, held in the truth of unconditional love is the best and only term I've got to go with it. So that is, you know, how that description comes. And just while I'm at that, it turns out that my sense has been that the emotional love has its seat more in the center of the heart. And this resonant flavor of movement is more on the left side of the heart as a non-feeling, like a non-emotion, non-conscious kind of material seat. So there will be many flavors that we could talk about, you know, in terms of the way consciousness might cycle through. But in the purity of the foundational elements of creation, you could say pure consciousness becoming aware of itself, right, and the process of. We have consciousness as the awareness field. Now, some people say that source is consciousness. So whatever we call source, whether it's the Big Bang or consciousness or God, the elements of three show up: the awareness nature, the manifest nature, and the interrelatedness nature. And in their purity, consciousness or awareness, manifest existence or beingness, and the relatedness as universal love or love. So in that way, I do distinguish consciousness from loveness, but actually it's a flow of consciousness into the recognition of itself and its interconnected process. So of course, you know, both are true. Nice. So in answer, yes. And in answer of our following our whole being realization, well, people in other traditions, you know, had bypassed the body, but in their growing realization, but in embodied realization, we're finding the deliciousness of consciousness, beingness, and love actually as the structure of manifestation. You know, and so we can talk about it both ways. Yes, as the natural flow that is always inclusive in consciousness, or we can talk about it in the way that our embodied realization is not just of the conscious nature, but is in form, but not devoid of. And later, you know, I might mention at the end, there's a way we can find the seed of the sacred in the chest of the in which it's not about heart realization. It's about the discovery of sacred heart as the seed of the divine, as essence of creation, as self. And that comes at the tail end of this continued refinement process, which you know, I've talked about in other offerings that I've done.
And that's seated on the right side?
No, it's more, from my experience, right in the center of the chest. It's a different realization. The location seems similar, but the heart realization I've just described is not the same as the seed of the divine. And that's something different that I could maybe add some words at the end, which I have talked about in other places. It's not coincidental that it's there, but it is of a different character.
Awesome. Yeah, beautiful. These maps, you know, it's what's the word I'm looking for? Just to hear your confession of it is somehow I don't have the right word. I don't have the words. It just takes the lid off of what normal what we conceive as normal human existence, and that's a beautiful thing. So thank you for inspiring that opening.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm.
Yeah. It turned out that I was kind of resolved to whole being realization being the wonderful thing, but I had been, as many of us have, reading the scriptures of ultimate realizations, but this was embodied time, so I'm honoring that. But what my continued unfoldment has found is that nothing is excluded within this embodied awakening. It's just that we add to it the juice of creation, and nothing is excluded in the potential of realization. So that's pretty exciting for all of us as we just engage in what being is bringing to us right now in this stage of human evolution.
Mm. One little piece, I know Cynthia wants to jump in.
Mm-hmm.
It's going back to the original question, and that is the the deepening or the seeding of love is the just the active dynamic of this circular self-referential process.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what's happening, and that's how love becomes more and more active, or more and more tangible, and even as you've been describing in the different ways.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the purposefulness of form, like, or it is the result. Form is the result of that flow. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, I love what you're saying, what you're pointing to. And that flow you're talking about, I'm meeting the mechanics of this, kind of whole being realization shifts. But what you're describing is the profound origin and also the resulting discovery. And we're doing it through the body. And it turned out the body isn't a loss. It's actually adding something that maybe hasn't been there in human realization before because of the inclusion of the form and in and as it. So.
Wow. Okay.
Great points. Yeah, you're welcome. Cynthia.
So, I think I just came to understand something that fits in with what you're talking about that I didn't realize until this evening or the last half hour that it fits in. So sometimes I have this, sometimes, very often at certain points, but sometimes I have the experience of seeing the incredible beauty of someone or something, the exquisite aliveness and beauty. And I have a reaction, I have a welling up of, I haven't had a word for it, so the best I would have been able to say is an appreciation, or it's stronger than that though. It's like a reverence, or even a feeling of honoring to the point of worshipfulness. That incredible, the beauty. And I think that is a flavor of love.
I think so too. And your words are just lovely because they add expressions to that. I use the word love now. I tried to not use it for a long time because it had so many connotations. And for some people, they don't want to use it in relation to your cells in your body, But for me, I just can't find any better word. I surrendered. But I love your words. They're like love words, in form. So I would say that's it. And when we find that, we actually find at our core, if we notice that interrelationship with infinite and finite, and we actually, our form is love, that tridox turns into, the origins of manifestation, consciousness, beingness, and love, the fire of life, the fire of manifestation. And your words are just so beautiful because when we know it in our own being, body, it's a discovery. You don't know how to do it, you can't do it. Somebody doesn't do it. You discover it, you know it, you have it.
And also the potential for that is there in every single moment.
Yes.
Potential for that is always there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And in every single person. Because it's not a skill. It's not a job to learn. It's an uncovering of discovery.
It's great. It comes through grace.
Mm-hmm.
And we're finding a way to increasingly open and be with what is. Our seeking stopped into allowing, and we're allowing grace to go where it wants to go. And this seems to be what it's bringing us to.
I could bow down. I could bow down to this.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the words that emerged in a particular shift was adoration.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else? I wanted to share also a bit about the synthesis that goes on, that realization. All of that is open to and recognized. And of course, realizations are the beginning of the next discovery of what it brings. And we then integrate it. And with this, particularly on the ground of this whole being continuity realization stage, then heart is a joy to integrate rather than a challenge. That doesn't mean there won't be waves of confusion at times, but it is a gentle process of allowing. And let me share this continued piece. So what I call the synthesis can show up as whole being love recognition. So what we've noticed in these incremental elements as a whole being realization, we start to have this, recognize something that I felt called whole being love, where it's not discriminated, but it's being known in a more integrated way. And it has flavors, again, of the three, where we are knowing love, being love, and living love. And these terms came because as I appreciated the discriminative 3 and 1, every stage, as I felt the whole beingness of it, this is, not discriminating, unconditional from embodied, from interpersonal, but just feeling the love field known and realized, then the subtlety of just knowing love. For lack of any other term, as Ori, you said, how can you put words to it? Well, this is the no words for it, but knowing. The no words for it, but being it. Actually not relating to it, but being love. And in engagement in life, living love. Living love, not meaning I'm making bigger tips or saying nicer things, but actually knowing I can't not live it. Whether I'm behaving more nicely or not so nicely. It's the flow of love in form. And so that synthesis is kind of the juice then of the integrated realization. Yeah. Knowing love, being love, living love. And that comes into being lived as a whole being heart awake life, as a stage that goes on with this realized heart quality, the realized elements, the synthesized integrated sense of whole being love, and then living life, living whole being heart awake life as a continuum of conscious love, manifest love, and mutual love. I'm not meaning we need to kind of pull anything apart. I mean, this is the wording of glorification of what we're realizing has emerged through the three dimensions. And it's part, to me, of the gift of whole being realization. Rather than jumping to oneness or oneness love, this is actually knowing the dimensions of self and other, of creation itself, and living a life in which love is true. Love is known, lived, and been. And it goes on as further refinements unfold, you know, as I've described in other offerings, further unfoldments. But there's nothing lacking when we've established that whole being continuity ground of our realization. But there is the enrichment and glorification of it that comes through grace, as we've discussed, that is inclusive of our interest in it. You know, it's kind of like the talking about it together enlivens its possibility and enlivens our noticing of it. And I found that with people that I've been sharing this with over time, that actually it's coming alive just by others hearing about it and wondering and thinking, because it's in our field, in our potential, and therefore it's enlivened once discriminated. So I'll just unshare this and check with you if there's anything more about that. Any further tastes of experience, that sense of whole being love, you know, that is the spectrum of what's been realized, and the living of life in which sometimes we're more intimate and personal with people or creation, and other times not so, but the undeniability of the love nature being lived is known, experienced, felt. Yes, Carrie.
So this is probably digging into some other traditions and things, but and certainly what's out there as far as what has to happen with the ego structure. So is there a you know the term Laisha Vidya from the,
yes, I do.
It's that remains of separation or whatever. Is that part of what is still there in terms of this wholeness? Is there this because some traditions, they say, well, the me has just disappeared and it's just this everything's still functioning and I'm still in the world, but I'm just this flow of consciousness.
There's much more to share and say in that area, but I could briefly say that this heart realization provides the foundation for the fire of life realization. That's where we kind of, the discovery of core love provides the ground for discovering the fire of life that arises as us and everything. So it's a progression that doesn't need, we can realize anything at any time, but in terms of a stabilized and integrated knowing unfolding, the heart realization, the whole being heart realization and knowing self as core love and all is love provides the ground to begin to shift from holding a paradox to holding a tridoxical connection with self, infinite and finite, into discovering self as one of the poles initially. that self that had felt so uncomfortable is coming into being love, knowing love, and infinite and finite and love are the original three into one, one into three. And so then we're discovering it within our own realization. And what's exciting then is that when that starts to be obvious, we can actually change our view from holding to being. And that's what I mentioned the other day when we or earlier when we were talking, I was talking about this with you, is that we can go from holding our realization of what we've realized and that inner core to having discovered a fire of manifestation that is not one thing. It's actually three things that never, if we were to merge them, we would put out the fire of creation. There'd be nothing.
Mm.
So the three coexist but never merge.
Mm.
When we know them, when the realization is well established and integrated, then we're free to be that creation, living the fire of creation. And so I noticed a very interesting choice at times when this was becoming apparent. It was kind of like, oh, okay, there comes something that's a little bit bothersome. I can hold it. Oh, but I have the choice of the other side of the coin, which is just live it. And so we begin to find ourselves living that which has been realized, the three, the fire, that manifestation of form. We get to begin to just live as it. Holding isn't useful, isn't necessary. We're actually, we are the fire of life. And when we tap into just being it, it's exhilarating.
Mm.
And it's still self. So this has been a process of the self evolving and awakening. The self has a whole being realization that's inclusive of the infinite and beyond. And then it becomes more intimately stabilized where trust is our ground. And then we find more of the stabilization of love as the field that we are in relationship, in holding this relationship. And then we become the expression of, the lived expression of manifestation, where form came into expression from the one becoming three, or as you described, that consciousness cycling back on itself. And then all of creation emerges. Well, we discover ourselves as all of that creation form. And that is such freedom, and that is still self. And that's where that Lesha Vidya might become, where we're no longer attached, we're free. We don't have to hold on to this. We don't have to defend the ego or anything. Because if it's really integrated, there's nothing, it's just truthness.
Mm.
And that's where the magic of a discovery came that I didn't expect.
Mm.
And that was the self fully realized, not needing to find anything else, and then recognized with a growing clarity, no self.
Mm.
And there's no need to hold on to self in that condition, because if it's really integrated, it's truth. If no self is there and true, then it's true. So there isn't any conflict. They're just two truths. It's like a paradox being discovered at that point, remarkably.
Well, some,
Go ahead.
you know, some would characterize it more as well, that the self is seen now as an illusion. It was a construct that never actually existed. But yeah. I'm liking what you're saying, is that there's no need to even label it, that it's just there as part of wholeness, if I'm going down the right road.
Absolutely. I would say the other description that you talked about reflects the non-dual path that hasn't fully acknowledged or realized embodiment.
Right.
Even if for those who might have felt like they're honoring embodiment, if they haven't come through and recognized the divine kind of emergence as all form, then it would be an illusion. But an illusion of that form now looks to me like duality. And this discovery of self fully formed, not needing to be defended, the ego isn't going to protect itself, just true. Existence true, and oh my gosh, non-existence true. Confusing. And nothing to be done because it's just true. Well, the gentle allowing of that, living as self, no self, I've actually given a name to, that realization of self, no self, is, you could say, the peaceful holding of a duality that isn't that both coexist without any issue. Well, over time of holding those two, a transformation can occur where it is a continuum. Where in my language, that which is before creation, sacred, is now alive and apparent in the subtlest and all aspects of form. So what's been realized as form, rediscovering the origin of form, can discover no form, and then can find, without doing anything or needing to do anything or even wanting anything, the undeniability of essence, what I call essence, sacred essence. Sacred because it's before form, and form not separate, not here and there. And it was so interesting in a particular experience that I've described longer in other presentations. At some point, not looking for something else, but just being aware of the angst of humanity wanting something, wanting to be saved, wanting something. And in a special circumstance that I describe more at a different time, being present with that curiosity of what are they looking for and how am I feeling, I felt no heart discomfort, no needing. And then I just noticed this subtle existence of self somehow longing or wanting or feeling the gap between that sense in that moment and that which was before emergence. And unprovoked and unrequested, that's where the discovery of the sacred emergence of a, the way it was for me, like a ribbon of love seated in the center of the heart as a sacred heart of self. And it was love, it was seated there in the fire of creation, in the oxygen of source. And divinity then as self and as all is just undeniable. And it's seated in everyone. It's not specialized, it's always been. But the life force, the life seat, the life center, the emergence of life is always connected to origin and is realizable as the divine seated in self, and allows the knowing of sacred self, sacred creation, not special to anyone, but just a recognized truth that has further to evolve and can even be realized as a sacred singularity, as pure consciousness, absolute being, infinite love, bliss, parallel to Sat Chit Ananda, only having been discovered through form that has never left form behind and has never created an illusion of form, because there's nothing that isn't sacred or isn't divine. They adjust. This is the creation, no preference, and true, for lack of any really useful concrete words to say it.
Wow.
So that so I did go beyond this presentation for that.
Oh my God. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's astounding, really, that that we're coming through a doorway of embodiment, and perhaps realizing something in a way that needed embodiment to be fully glorious in ways we might not have thought of. And this emergence of these recognitions and discriminations just came about in a guy who's an educator-oriented person, who's a teacher, and who wanted to find ways to share each, a shift with others, because I'm a teacher and I love to do that with folks. And so I started to make little chart forms to share it with others so I could talk a little more clearly. And then not knowing that a whole unfoldment of a map would occur that captures these 3 dimensions of every shift. And, it's like living, well, it's really living cognition, the realizations. We have cognitions as the realizers.
I was going to say, it sounds like the Veda. You just talking about
Yes.
the Veda becoming.
Yes.
It's just.
And it includes revelation, because what I found in the realizations were accompanied by a bodily being knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like revelatory. It filled out. You could describe. You could talk.
Mm.
And it also needs expression. And so the chart forms were part of a way to express. Teaching these things was a way to express. And my companionship with Ralph Humphreys, who was my student over all these years and companion in putting out materials, he was like a sounding board and a wise, awakened questioner, so that everything that kind of was being discovered could be tested to feel the truth of it, in being.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so it's been just a gift of unfoldment that, for me personally, that had no plan and still doesn't have a plan other than continuing to be true to what seems to want to be expressed or is called for. And it turned out that last fall, Ralph and I offered a whole being evolution course of 8 modules, about 2 hours each one, all recorded. And there's a whole map of about 116 pages of charts that kind of give a concreteness to what's being talked about and shared. And Alf and I have been checking on it, and it's still profound. And it takes us through the whole being realization, the heart, the fire, the no self, the essence, sacred heart, sacred singularity. So if anyone wants to delve in, it seems to be holding up well as a source of something that we can connect with. And Ralph being, kind of an awakened being with a long background, both spiritually and educationally, it's been lovely to have his companionship and, kind of activation as a catalyst in that process. And, he was a Buddhist monk in residence for 5 years. And he was, his part of his PhD education was in the area of paradox. So, it's kind of the magic of he and I being able to kind of share in this unfoldment together. And also for him to describe how this unfoldment of the descriptions, this map, have been activating his awakening through each of these stages, just by being engaged and discriminative and talking and sharing with others. So to the extent that you're interested, any of you, it's a source of something that you can enjoy as you might wish.
Again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for your interest, Carrie, and the profound points that you've brought up. It's so enlivening just to hear those recognitions that we can, talk about together without knowing that words can't quite do it, but we actually have a sense of what we're talking about, and that's so thrilling.
It's very live.
And I'm just going to share with you, I had a closing description of this that summarizes it that I put together a little while ago. And so whole being heart realization, a post whole being realization of the nature of love. This realization is inclusive of one's universal conscious nature as unconditional love, personal manifest nature as embodied love, and interconnected mutual nature as interpersonal love. These dimensions of heart realization may be sequentially realized over time, or may occur in one shift in which the dimensions can become discriminatively recognized later. Integrated heart realization manifests in life as knowing love, being love, and living love. Lovely to be able to share this with you, and loving to be able to share this with you. So we're ready to go for the night and meet up tomorrow morning, early morning offering, and then our large group meeting. Yes, Rolando. Can't hear you, Rolando. You're muted. Yeah, there you go.
In the morning, you introduced about awareness, consciousness. In this presentation, you mentioned a continuity of realization.
Yes.
We're going to sleep now. I was thinking about what happens with awareness, consciousness in deep sleep, or deep dreamless sleep. If there's a continuity.
Yeah.
Can you say something?
Yeah. Well, when I use the word continuity, it's that somehow the realization isn't shaken, no matter what, when we're aware. You know, so that continuity isn't shaken in the dream state, and it isn't shaken in the deep sleep, whether we're conscious or not. Some people feel conscious in deep sleep, some may not. But this continuity realization is saying the whole being realization that oscillates post whole being realization for years as we become more and more integrated in it. At some point, we find a ground that doesn't oscillate, while oscillation may occur, but we have that kind of stability. So does that show up in different states of awareness like sleep? Well, for me it does, but it doesn't require anything, because the stability and wellness has its own truth. And dream sleep is a process where there's release, therefore it can take any form. But where deep sleep, if we have awareness, it'll have a stability of trust. And if we don't have awareness, then it's just our whole being going through that. So I know it's probably not the same, specifics you want, but that feels like enough to say, just to generalize about this continuity being a stable ground, that our realization isn't doubted and our trust in the ground of creation isn't shaken. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good night, everybody.
Rod, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a really rich and rewarding, wonderful, beautiful, all the words experience. Thank you so much for sharing your deep work with us.
Yeah, it's kind of come to life in its usual surprising and magical way for me. I just was going to present, and then I started to notice, well, why don't I show this and that? And it kind of, took its own course. So it's such a gift to live life and flow. And that's the work that we're doing in Trillium Awakening, and any field that's leaning into whole beingness as the ground for anything is possible to be realized.
Yeah. Your joy is so obvious. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your attendance today, for all the ways that you showed up today. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful sleep. And we'll see you tomorrow on this link right here. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.